Okay. An emergency came up, so that's why I'm late. Otherwise, I try to be on time. Okay, last week at the question and answer period, Angus gave a talk on William Blake, and a viewer found it painful to watch. The viewer says, "You two weren't on the same page or in the same chapter or even in the same book, were you? Hope things improve in the coming weeks. This was painful to watch. I felt for you, Angus. Maybe share a live stream with someone who knows, likes, or at least wants to understand William Blake would be more fruitful in the future." So my performance was considered painful to watch. Let's take a look at what happened last week in the question and answer session on Sunday.
Tom, what chapter 2 for you?
Let me do that again, just to make sure I have it set up right so you can hear it. Okay. So this is from last week's question and answer session where Angus was giving a talk on William Blake and how he relates to Rudolf Steiner's philosophy of freedom.
Or how does that relate into? How does that link into your take on what's the essence of chapter 2?
Well, I don't really know. I don't really understand Blake too well, and it's kind of I didn't really see the slides before, so I haven't really thought about it.
So it took on that like monism, dualism, which is like introducing that idea of monism and dualism, like for a different way to the way in which Steiner does it in chapter 2.
Actually, I think you said you're going to get back to. Did you say you were going to get back to this, or did you answer that question?
Yeah, I did. I answered that.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I thank you for your presentation.
Okay, I'll carry on. If you're not, I didn't want it to turn into a monologue, but I'm happy to go on talking a little bit there. So this monism and dualism that he talks heavily about.
So Angus wasn't too happy with my performance, nor were the viewers. So Angus is looking for someone new who's committed to the philosophy of freedom and has an interest in art, literature, etc., to help illuminate the philosophy of freedom from different perspectives. So if that suits you and you'd be interested in appearing with Angus to discuss literature and art to help illuminate the philosophy of freedom, contact us on the contact form on the philosophyofreedom.com website, and we would really be happy to have you. So, looking at last week, we had the William Blake lecture, which actually it was a very good talk put on by Angus about William Blake. You know, other than my participation, otherwise the rest of it was went very well. And then we also last week we posted 3 videos. Also included was the 12 worldviews summary of the preface by me, So if you have an interest in Steiner's 12 worldview theory and how it relates to the philosophy of freedom, you might find that interesting. And then we also put out an open letter to Austin Waldorf from Chris Prosser, who's a parent in a Waldorf and had a problem with the Austin Waldorf school when he discovered that there was critical race theory in the school. And it's kind of a sad story. So there's that video that went out last week, and that will be, let's take a look at the upcoming videos. The Chris Prosser interview video, first he wrote a letter and then that circulated around the Waldorf community about his story of what happened at the Austin Waldorf School. So we've followed that up with an interview, and that will be coming out probably later next week. Then we've interviewed a philosophy of freedom artist, and that may not come out next week, but it may come out the following week. And then next week, we're also going to have an identity politics video versus individuality. That'll be coming out maybe in the middle of the week. Okay, how can you get involved? You can subscribe to YouTube. You can subscribe to the website and get weekly email updates, or you can subscribe to the Twitter feeds at Rudolf Steiner or at Anthroposophy. And I want to do a new video series. How do you apply the philosophy of freedom to your life? What I want to do is take, your normal average reader of the philosophy of freedom and have them express how they apply the philosophy of freedom to their lives. Because these are the people that Rudolf Steiner dedicated the book to. Those who apply the principles in the philosophy of freedom to their lives, because those are the ones that are on the path of the philosophy of freedom. It's not good enough just to try to understand the book. It's meant to be applied to life. And what I set up was, if you contact me, I can send you a link, and that link will take you to a Zoom room. And when you enter the Zoom room, it will start recording, and then you can tell your story. And then if you stutter or something, you can start again, because we will get that recording and edit it, and then, make use of it either as a video in itself or maybe with some other people's stories. So all you have to do is contact me on the contact form at philosophy-of-freedom.com, and I'll send you the link. You can go into the room and record your story. This will be very helpful in getting the word out and helping people in their study of the philosophy of freedom, so you can get involved. Also, if you have some knowledge about the philosophy of freedom that you've worked through, we hope that you will share it. And all you have to do is contact me, and we'll set up an interview, and you can, share what you've learned about the philosophy of freedom. Or if you have a story to tell about Waldorf or Anthroposophy, which are engaged in a culture war right now. So there's kind of a fight to save Waldorf and Anthroposophy. If you have any stories about that, let us know. We'd like to interview you about it. Okay, we got some, what we want to do is work off of some questions for this Sunday edition. Now, so last week we got some questions. If you have any questions this week, please post them, and we'll either address them today or next week. But last week we got a question from Patricia that is, it is a struggle in the world today to be morally free. How can we stay on moral ground? Okay, that's a very important question. Yes, it's a struggle. How can we stay on moral ground? Well, actually, it's you could almost say it's impossible. Basically, everything that science is, the scientific research and the view of the materialists that say we're basically determined by culture, by group think, by our family, that our thinking has been conditioned and determined, our behavior has been conditioned and determined. We have no idea how true that is. I mean, because we live under the illusion of freedom. So it's very real issue, way more than most people come close to realize how conditioned we are. But there is hope, and it's in the video, which I think is the most important video I ever made, which is Science Breakthrough Verifies Rudolf Steiner's Impulse of Freedom. It can be found on the YouTube channel. And Steiner discovered that freedom is possible because of a power within intuitive thinking. And that what he discovered was verified by cognitive researchers. In chapter 9, Steiner wrote, "The essence which is active in thought has a twofold function. First, it restricts the human organization in its own activity. Next, it steps into the place of that organization. Yes, even the former, the restriction of human organization, is an effect of the activity of thought, and more particularly of that part of it which prepares the manifestation of thinking." So he's saying thinking, the intuitive impulse, what Steiner calls the impulse of freedom, this intuitive impulse, which comes out of thinking, it's intellectual intuition, which is what Steiner calls it in one of the books before the Philosophy of Freedom. He calls it intellectual intuition. It has a twofold function. First, this human organization of our conditioning that determines how we think, determines how we act, it restricts that. It holds it back. Otherwise, so we don't get this impulse from our existing established character, existing established personality. It restricts it as this impulse comes in of intuitive thought. Then it steps in place of that opening with a new insight, which then becomes a new cause that establishes human freedom. Then out of that idea or that thought, then can be the basis of action. And then we can perform a free deed. So a book came out called the Eureka Factor. Let me just check to make sure that everything's working. Okay, I don't see anybody saying it's not. A book came out a few years ago, the Eureka Factor, Aha Moments, Creative Insight in the Brain by John Kunos and Mark Beeman. What they did, they're cognitive scientists. They studied the aha moment, that moment of creative insight, the intuitive insight. They studied it, and what they discovered was it has two parts. The first part is an alpha wave burst, shown in this diagram under the pink line. Here's the aha moment. But before the aha moment, before you become conscious of an intuitive thought, there's an alpha wave burst, which restricts external input. So it's providing that space that Steiner talked about, where he said thinking plays a two-part. First, it restricts it restricts the human organization in its own activity. So here we have it in this alpha wave burst. That restricts and opens up a place for a gamma wave burst of the aha moment, of the experience of an intuitive thought that enhances thinking. And then they studied the characteristics of this aha moment, this gamma wave burst. They said that it enhanced thinking, increased intelligence, improved focus, increased energy, more tolerance, and more compassion. So this is related to the impulse of freedom that Steiner is talking about, that makes freedom possible. But not only makes freedom possible, but does all these other things. It enhances thinking, which anybody who has observed this experience recognizes the enhanced thinking. You can recognize the increased intelligence, the improved focus, all these things on this list. It's energizing. It gives you more tolerance, more compassion. All these things on this list you can recognize in that intuitive insight moment, which then becomes an impulse to freedom, where we break free of all that conditioned behavior and become a free spirit and are able to perform a free deed. So how can we stay on moral ground? Well, we need to cultivate the impulse of freedom, which is really what the philosophy of freedom is about. It's not about philosophy of trying to prove freedom philosophically. You can't do that. What it's about is an experience of freedom, to recognize the impulse of freedom, which we all have. If we're a normal functioning person, we're going to have these experiences. The idea is to have them more often and to cultivate that experience. I mean, that's the path of the philosophy of freedom. The first step is to become aware of how important this is and really value that experience. I mean, the philosophy of freedom is going to go through chapter by chapter and be adding knowledge about this experience, because there's a lot involved here. It goes through all the different, because we want to be operating out of true knowledge. We want to be operating out of our true self. I mean, it's all related to the impulse of freedom, but there's many kind of aspects of it that is dealt with in every chapter of the philosophy of freedom. So it becomes a kind of a major process of learning to really develop it. But the way you develop it is the path of the philosophy of freedom, which is apply the principles in the book to life and practice pure thinking. The way you practice pure thinking is you enter into it either through like reading the philosophy of freedom, by reading pure thinking, something that's written in pure thinking, which is pure universal concepts, like in philosophy, in mathematics. Either engage in the study of this kind of material, or just sit down and think in what you might call philosophical thinking, or just thinking. And you see, what you can do is you can take a life situation. In psychology, they do this all the time after a counseling session. they'll take the things, they'll conceptualize the situation. So they'll be given all these details about a particular case or something, and then they conceptualize it. That's going up into pure thinking to bring in universal principles that they've learned in their education and training, and connect those up with the person that they're dealing with, that they're counseling. So you can enter into pure thinking by entering in the conceptual realm and thinking. I mean, the practice of pure thinking, it's not going into some blank meditation or something. It's thinking in pure universal concepts. Okay, let me check. Let me look at the comments here. Dimensions of will. Oops. Freedom. You are the perfection of your own dream. Okay, from Jay Zen. Thank you. Now, Elliot had a question from last week that we're discussing this week. In other works, Steiner describes a path of imaginative thinking, inspired thinking, and finally intuitive thinking. How does this compare to the path of philosophy of freedom? And what is meant by intuition in the philosophy of freedom? What is moral imagination? What is moral intuition? What is moral imagination? Okay, that's another good question. If you see this presentation in a video, if you watch the video later, and you want to submit a question, go to philosophyofreedom.com and submit a question on the contact form, and then we could talk about it next Sunday. I mean, I like to get a chance to prepare ahead of time to answer a question. So please, if you watch this video, post your questions. Let's see, I guess you could post it on the video also. Just post it on the video in the comments. So first, I'll just do a review of what moral imagination, moral intuition, and technique mean in the philosophy of freedom. These are three aspects of a free ethical deed. Moral intuition is the ability to intuitively select an ethical principle to apply for a particular life situation. An ethical deed has an ethical principle and an ethical ideal that guides the deed. That's what makes it ethical. So the way we arrive at that ethical ideal is through pure thinking. That's what makes it free, because we find freedom in pure thinking. Because when we enter into the conceptual realm, we rise up to that level and then let thought determine thought. We free ourselves from all the conditioning, and free thinking becomes possible. So that's the place where we select an intuitive principle to guide the deed. Now, of course, this is the way I'm going to describe these three things is kind of a laborious process, but these things can happen very fast in real life. That's why it's important to become conscious of these things to see what's going on. And it's also important to look back at a deed of something you've done and see if you can identify the ethical principle that was guiding it. And then you can determine if it was a free deed or not. Because a free deed, you'll be able to identify the principle, the moral idea of the deed. Moral imagination is the ability to imaginatively translate a universal ethical principle into a specific goal of the action to be carried out. See, this ethical principle is a universal, like do good, make the world a better place. I mean, it's a universal principle. It doesn't really give you specific instructions on how to act in a particular situation. This is attained through moral imagination, where we've select the principle, the universal principle we want to apply to a particular case. Now we translate that into a specific goal of action. In specific detail, we picture what we want to accomplish. This is our goal. And then we move to moral technique, which is the ability to transform the world according to one's ethical imaginations without violating the natural laws by which things are connected. So now we have our goal that we want to accomplish, and we need to apply it to the world. So, for example, if you're a teacher, you want to teach your children math or something. Through your teacher training, you will learn techniques on how to apply that to a particular child based on their temperaments or what you know about the child. There will be ways to teach that, what you want to teach, in a specific way to that specific child by understanding how that the mind of that child works, or whatever they do, whatever you learn as to become a teacher, without violating the natural laws. Another example of that is to bring a cultural change. You can use war and just go in and tear down a country and then impose your new culture on that country. Or you can demonstrate and riot and terrify everybody into accepting your new cultural rules. But that's can be violating the natural laws of the existing culture, which then creates unnecessary disruption. So it's important to understand to bring about change, you're going to create disruption to some degree. So you want to minimize it. And you do that by understanding how things are working now, and then just try to adjust that in as a peaceful way as possible by gaining cooperation rather than using authoritarian force, as you see in Canada right now, with Trudeau using his authoritarian force to make things the way he wants. He's violating the freedom of people, of their freedom of health choice. But that's what authoritarians do. Now, to get back to how these definitions are different in anthroposophy, I refer to the Michael Wilson introduction to his translation of the revised philosophy of freedom. In the philosophy of freedom, the terms intuition and imagination are used according to normal English usage, not in the way they are used in Steiner's later anthroposophy. So when you see intuition and imagination in the philosophy of freedom, they're used in the same way we normally use those words. But if you see them in anthroposophy, that's not the case. They're used in a different way. So Michael Wilson says, any work describing Steiner's point of view in terms of English philosophy would have to deal with the mind as a central theme. And that is, the mind is a central theme of the philosophy of freedom. But here our task as anthroposophists, is to introduce readers to Steiner's concepts of spirit and soul. So Michael Wilson, in his translation, believed that, yes, the philosophy of freedom is about the mind as a central theme, but we need to make it more about the spirit and soul to do our duty as anthroposophists. So I call that spiritualizing the philosophy of freedom. An example of that, see what we're dealing with, two editions of the philosophy of freedom, the 1894 original edition, and then the 1918 revised edition, which Rudolf Steiner revised, and then the various translators kind of further tampered with to bring in to spiritualize the book, because the audience of the philosophy of freedom had completely changed. The original philosophy of freedom was written for science-minded libertarians. They were actually individualist anarchists, but they were libertarians that really weren't interested that much in spiritual things. So after 1900, Steiner became a theosophist after he left the philosophy of freedom and took on a whole new audience of spiritually minded people. But he still believed that the philosophy of freedom still needed to be the basis of gaining knowledge and the basis for an ethical life, a moral life, as depicted in ethical individualism. So he still believed that the philosophy of freedom remained as a foundation, whether you're a libertarian or if you're a spiritualist. But anyways, so he wanted to make the book accepted by the spiritualists. So he kind of everybody tried to spiritualize the philosophy of freedom to engage the theosophists into the philosophy of freedom, who weren't so much inclined to reading a book like that. An example, there's many examples throughout the book where they basically tried to add the word spirit and spiritual as many times as possible. For example, in the opening sentence of the chapter 1, the original version was, "Is man in his thinking and action free?" Where in the spiritualized version of 1918, which is basically what you're going to find in most of the translations today, it's "Is man in his thinking and action a spiritually free being?" See, it was now man is a spiritually free being. Spiritually, you got the word spiritual in there, so it was spiritualized. If you want an original version of the philosophy of freedom, you can find it on the website at philosophyofreedom.com under what is it? It's one of the links on the top banner, easy to read edition or something like that. It's an easier to read edition of the original philosophy of freedom. And Michael Wilson goes on to say, intuition in the philosophy of freedom is again the same as a German word and means the faculty and process of grasping concepts, in particular, the immediate apprehension of a thought without reasoning. Okay, then he says, this is normal English usage. So he confirms what I was saying, that intuition in the philosophy of freedom is used like it normally is. And then Michael Wilson says, imagination in the philosophy of freedom means the faculty and process of creating mental pictures. The word is the same as the German imagination. In later writing, which is, okay, so it's it's using your imagination to, I've said earlier, to create an imaginative picture out of a universal principle or universal truth. But it's basically the faculty of imaginative thinking. that any creative person uses all the time. Michael Wilson goes on to say, in later writings, Steiner describes how this ordinary faculty of imagining or making mental pictures can be developed to the point where it becomes the faculty of actually perceiving the creative ideas behind the phenomena of nature. In these later writings, imagination becomes a special term to indicate this level of perception, but in the philosophy of freedom, the meaning remains near the ordinary usage. Now, this idea in anthroposophy of perceiving the creative ideas behind the phenomena of nature, I would say that's really kind of open to that's very speculative, in that I'm not really aware of anybody who's really attained that ability to see these so-called creative ideas in the form of mental pictures of the phenomena behind the phenomena of nature. I consider that highly speculative, and I'm not aware of anybody who's actually achieved that. But anyways, Michael Wilson goes on to say, in later writings, Steiner could describe a stage of perception still higher called imagination, the stage of intuition, in which one immediately apprehends the reality of other spiritual beings, although the philosophy of freedom deals only with spiritual content of pure thinking. Here's another kind of a speculative ability from anthroposophy, apprehending the reality of other spiritual beings. I mean, I don't know if anybody can do that. Of course, I don't put any limits on what Steiner was able to do. He was born with special clairvoyant abilities, so that's way beyond what I can likely comprehend for his spiritual clairvoyance. But I'm not just really sure that it's been duplicated by anybody since then. So here's how intuition is defined in the philosophy of freedom. The form in which thought first appears in consciousness, we will call intuition. This appears in chapter 5. Intuition is to thoughts what observation is to percepts. Intuition and observation are the sources of our knowledge. So that's a normal understanding of intuition. It's an intuition is when thought first appears in our consciousness. We have an intuition. It's something that we're constantly experiencing all day long. Though there's different levels of intuition that we experience. In the 1918 revised edition, another definition is added. In the spiritualized edition of the philosophy of freedom, a spiritualized definition appeared that wasn't in the original edition. And this new definition of intuition is a purely spiritual conscious experience of a purely spiritual content. It is only through intuition that we can grasp the essence of thinking. This appears in chapter 9, where we bring in, I believe it's saying the same thing as the other definition, except now it's been spiritualized, where we say the purely spiritual conscious experience, which is basically the thought entering into our mind, but we call it purely spiritual conscious experience because that's very spiritual. And then purely spiritual content, which is just a universal concept. But then we spiritualize with purely spiritual content in essence of thinking. So now that's the spiritualized definition, but I think it's the same thing. All right. Here's a final note. Post questions for next week's Sunday broadcast here or at philosophyofreedom.com. I mean, you can post it in the comments. Okay, let me look at the comments here. Jason says, love, wisdom, and absolute sovereignty. Right on. Let's see. Right on. I give a fist salute to love, wisdom, and absolute sovereignty. Yes. So beautiful. Yes. I'm with you, Jay Zen. Okay. I guess that wraps it up. If please submit some questions and give us some content for next week. And I will see you next week. Bye.